Welcome, American literature friends. This is just a short definition video for the definition of passing narrative. Now, a passing narrative is a story of a person classified as a member of one racial group. They might be classified as Jewish or African American or Native American or something like that. But they attempt and succeed often to be accepted as a member of a different racial or ethnic group. The term relates to Nella Larsen's, and this is where the terminology really originated from. Nella Larsen's 1929 short novella is called Passing, which deals with two biracial women, one who identifies as black and the other who identifies as white. They trade places, they pass as each other. So a passing narrative is really a story of a person who is socially and culturally accepted as a member of one racial or ethnic group, but they pass or disguise themselves, you might say, as a member of another racial group. The example for our syllabus is James Weldon Johnson's autobiography of an ex-colored man. The obvious passing in that novel is you have a light-skinned African-American man who is passing as a white man at different moments in different parts of the book. Especially in chapter 10, he passes back and forth. He goes from being identified as white to being identified as black. In the train car scene in chapter 10, he is identified as white and accepted as white in the whites only train car. There are other parts where he is clearly understood to be and identified as African American. At the very beginning of the novel, when he is coming back to the United States on the ship, he is very clearly passing as white, and he has to identify himself to the other African American passenger as also being black. There's a historic passing narratives really originate, they don't necessarily belong to, but they originate in the early 1900s from, say, James Weldon Johnson's novels published in 1912, but from that early 1900s, 1910s period to the 1920s and 1930s. They are pretty closely connected to the rise of Jim Crow and Jim Crow segregation laws. And you can understand why, because as the pressure of the Jim Crow laws and the intensity of segregation and the things like the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the race riots that happened in the early 20th century in places like Tulsa, Atlanta, Wilmington, North Carolina, as racial prejudice and bigotry intensified, you also have this intensification of passing and people attempting to, as the main character does in Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, in one way or another, escape these increasingly violent racial conditions in the United States by trying to escape being identified as a member of these persecuted groups, whether they were Jewish people or African Americans or Native Americans, these people trying to culturally and socially pass as a non-persecuted group. Passing narratives, there are still passing narratives still, even after the 1920s and 1930s, there are still passing narratives. The most famous one from after that time period is probably Black Like Me. And even when we get to Mouse by Art Spiegelman, there is some passing happening in that story where the father, Vladek, passes as a German or a Pole, even though he would have been classified by the Germans as a Jew, and so he is passing. So there's a bunch of different kinds of passing. Passing narratives still occur in one way or another, but this is really the cultural high water mark for them, the 19-teens, the 1920s, again corresponding to the rise of the Klan, lynching, the intensification of the Jim Crow laws. They're very clearly connected to and a response against those kinds of racial problems of the first 20 or 30 years of the 20th century. Let's see if we've missed anything else here. So a passing narrative is a story, fiction or nonfiction, of a person claiming a racial or ethnic identity that he or she does not possess. Such narratives speak to the authenticity the authenticity, so like what it means to authentically be white, what it means to authentically be black, and how that's socially and culturally constructed. The ambiguity, so like the sort of borderlines between, what if you're like James Weldon Johnson himself, and like the main character in Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, what if you're a very, very light-skinned African American? And as he mentions, as he gives an example in the book, what if you're a fairly dark-skinned Italian who would typically socially be identified as white, but then you get identified as African American because you have this sort of Mediterranean darker skin? The authenticity, the ambiguity, and the performance, so like what you perform to be, what you pretend to be, how you pretend to be white, how you pretend to be black, and not pretend to yourself, but pretend to the outer world that gets to decide who is who and what is what. Passing narratives speak to issues of official and traditional categorization. The passing narrative unsettles notions of belonging and ownership, and shows how race can be viewed as a social construct or a series of social conventions or cultural ideas or sort of culturally constructed meanings. If you have questions about passing narrative, and especially about that 19 teens, 1920, that sort of 20-30 year period where they really sort of blow up and appear on the cultural landscape, I'll be happy to dig into that with you. Just be in touch. Otherwise, I hope that's a good short definition for you. Thanks.